On December 5, 1945, 5 Navy aircraft took off from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for what was supposed to be a routine training mission. The crews were experienced military airmen. They knew the area, they knew the aircraft, and they were expected to return that afternoon. But they never came back. What followed was one of the largest searches of its kind, and one of the most enduring mysteries in aviation history. The flight was known as Flight 19. It consisted of 5 TBM Avenger aircraft and 14 men. The mission was a routine navigation and bombing exercise over the Bahamas. Their planned route was straightforward. They would fly east from the Florida coast, carry out practice bombing at Hens and Chickens shoals, continue north toward Grand Bahama Island, and then return to Fort Lauderdale. At the time, there was no reason to believe the mission would become anything extraordinary. The flight leader was Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, an experienced naval aviator who had logged roughly 2,500 hours of flight time and had served in combat during World War II. The other aircraft were piloted by instructors and student airmen taking part in the training exercise. At about 2 p.m., the 5 Avengers departed Fort Lauderdale. The first part of the mission went normally. The aircraft reached the bombing area and carried out their practice exercise. Nothing about the beginning of the flight suggested that the crews were about to face a crisis. Then something changed. After the bombing exercise, radio communications began to indicate that the flight was having navigation problems. The crews were no longer completely certain of their position, and that raised a serious question. If experienced military airmen were unsure where they were, how far had the flight already moved from its planned route? The answer would become increasingly difficult to determine. The problem was more serious than a simple wrong turn. Lieutenant Taylor reported that both of his compasses were not working. He believed the flight was over the Florida Keys. But that was not certain. Another Navy pilot, Lieutenant Robert Cox, tried to help Flight 19 determine its position and return to Fort Lauderdale. Taylor also asked whether the flight could be located by radar. The crews were now trying to figure out where they actually were and which direction would take them home. Back at Fort Lauderdale, other pilots and radio operators were trying to establish exactly what Flight 19 was seeing. Taylor believed he was near the Keys, but the Navy's later analysis concluded that the flight had likely become disoriented over the Bahamas. That distinction matters. The mystery was not simply that 5 aircraft disappeared. The available evidence suggests that the crews were struggling with navigation and that their position was becoming increasingly uncertain. But exactly how the flight reached its final location was never established with certainty. As the afternoon continued, the situation became worse. Radio communications became increasingly confused. At one point, Lieutenant Taylor turned leadership of the flight over to another pilot. The remaining crews were still attempting to determine their location and find a way back to land. Then came another problem. The sun was getting lower, and the aircraft were using fuel while they remained lost. The margin for error was disappearing. Then, the radio communications stopped. Flight 19 had disappeared from contact. By the time Flight 19 disappeared from contact, the Navy had already begun searching for the missing aircraft. 2 TBM Mariner flying boats were sent toward the last estimated position of the Avengers. One of them was Training 49. It carried a crew of 13. But about 10 minutes after departing, Training 49 also stopped communicating with the search station. There was now a second mystery. What had happened to the rescue aircraft? The disappearance of Training 49 was investigated separately. Witnesses reported seeing a bright flash or fire in the area where the aircraft was believed to be. The Navy later considered an in-flight fire a likely explanation. The TBM Mariner was known to have a design problem involving gasoline vapors that could accumulate in its bilges. But the exact cause of Training 49's loss was never established with complete certainty. 13 men were lost. The Navy's search operation continued for 5 days. Ships and aircraft searched a vast area of the Atlantic and Gulf waters, but nothing confirmed the fate of Flight 19. No aircraft were recovered. No confirmed wreckage was found. No confirmed trace of the 14 men aboard the 5 Avengers was discovered, and the search for Training 49 had also failed to produce survivors. The scale of the search was enormous. The answers were not. Then came the question that investigators could not answer. What actually caused Flight 19 to disappear? The Navy's official investigations struggled to reach a definite conclusion. Later Naval History and Heritage Command research has pointed to navigation problems and disorientation as the most likely explanation. One reconstruction suggests the flight may have mistaken the Bahamas for the Florida Keys, then continued farther into the Atlantic. Eventually, the aircraft may have run out of fuel and been forced down at sea. But there is an important distinction. That is a reconstruction, not something investigators were able to prove. The disappearance of Flight 19 did not end with the search. The Navy opened an investigation to determine what had happened. The investigators faced a difficult problem. There was no wreckage to examine, no survivors could explain the final moments, and no confirmed location of the 5 Avengers could be established. The official investigation ultimately concluded that the available evidence was not enough to determine exactly what caused the loss. In other words, even the investigators could not give a definite answer. Over time, however, another explanation became more prominent. The Navy's later historical analysis pointed toward navigation failure and disorientation. According to that reconstruction, Taylor may have mistaken the northern Bahamas for the Florida Keys. If the flight continued in the wrong direction, the aircraft would have moved farther out over the Atlantic instead of returning toward Florida. Eventually, fuel would have become a critical problem. But there is an important point here. This reconstruction explains much of the available evidence. It does not prove exactly where the aircraft went down. The 5 Avengers have still never been found. And then there is the legend. Flight 19 became closely associated with the Bermuda Triangle. Later stories added claims about strange weather, unexplained forces, and even extraterrestrial involvement. But those claims are not part of the established evidence. The Navy's own historical account describes the Bermuda Triangle and UFO stories as later lore surrounding the disappearance. The documented story is already mysterious enough. 5 aircraft left Florida on a training mission. They became disoriented. Their radio contact ended. A massive search found no confirmed trace, and their final resting place remains unknown. More than 80 years later, the central mystery remains. We know where Flight 19 began. We know its planned route. We know the crews encountered serious navigation problems. We know the Navy launched an enormous search. And we know that no confirmed wreckage of the 5 Avengers has ever been recovered. But we do not know the exact location where those aircraft disappeared. That is the part of Flight 19 that history has never been able to close. Not because we need a supernatural explanation, but because the physical evidence simply never came back.